Welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights. And now, Lora Cecere speaking at NAMM, September 2023, on the topic of supply chain resilience.
I'm going to talk about supply chain resilience and how we think about supply chain 2030. Well, it's not that far away, yeah. But if we think about supply chain, I am a contrarian, right? I'm an industry analyst, and people might say, well, what is the difference between an industry analyst and consultants? Consultants know the answers, and industry analysts are trying to figure out the questions. So I triangulate the market. I sit on a database of 700 different public manufacturers. I correlate the choices that they make to balance sheet results, and I analyze the impact of what they do. I write for Forbes, I write for LinkedIn. I'm followed by 320,000 people on LinkedIn, and I speak and I try to help people to improve their supply chain. So let's talk about resilience in 2030. How do you define resilience?
Being able to withstand either impact in the supply chain, the resilience of a shortage of raw material, that you're able to overcome that. You're still there the day after the wave hits.
Okay. The ability to withstand impact. Well, how else do you define resilience? Because we use all these words in supply chain, right? I'm going to be a resilient supply chain, but then I say, well, what does that mean? And they look at me like I'm the stupidest gal in the world. And you may think that at the end of the presentation. But I define resilience as the ability to have the same cost, quality, and customer service given the level of demand and supply variability. Now, most people are very supply-centric. If I tell you that in advanced planning, 8 out of 10 companies that I work with actually degrade the error in their forecast, and that is a huge resilience issue, most people don't think about that. Or when I talk to you about the bullwhip effect, right? How many of you have played the beer game? Not the one you did in college at the fraternity, but the beer game, right? Where you learned the principle of the bullwhip. How many measure the bullwhip from orders, channel to orders, orders to planned orders to purchase orders? When you do that, you find that the bullwhip effect in our current systems is about 300%, because we're literally threading the demand and supply signal through a complex nonlinear system. We are our own worst enemy. We are causing the supply chain to be less resilient, and we're proud of it. And I don't want you to be proud of it. I want you to challenge what we're doing, because only 3% of manufacturing companies today globally beat their peer group. We may pound our chest and say we're really good, but if only 3% of companies beat their peer group in growth, margin, inventory, and return on assets, we shouldn't be proud. We hold 28 more days of inventory today across all industries than in 2010. And we invest in advanced planning to do safety stock, but safety stock today is only 15 to 20% of inventory, where safety stock back when I wore my safety shoes was more like 45 to 50%. Cycle stock and in-transit stock have grown, and we don't manage it. We have yet to achieve economies of scale in supply chain. In my research, I find no company that's gone through mergers and acquisitions that is able to beat their peer group. So when you leave here and you have terms with your organization, I want you to be really cognizant what these mean. I want you to ask yourself, what is supply chain resilience? And most people make the supply chain less resilient by assuming the efficient supply chain is the most effective supply chain, and it is not. Only 20% of flow can be managed efficiently. So I define the efficient supply chain as the lowest cost supply chain. We have responsive supply chains that are all about time, things like flu vaccines and bathing suits. Those need to be managed based on time. We will never have the lowest cost supply chain for the supply chain that needs to be responsive. And then there's the agile supply chain, which is very low volume and not predictable. And we can't measure that in the same way we measure the efficient supply chain, but we need to manage flow. we don't have just one supply chain, we have multiple supply chains. And the fact that we don't manage them by flow is a resilience issue. So when you go home, I want you to measure volume and forecastability and look at a concept that I'm going to call demand latency, which is the time from the order to the channel for purchase and the distortion of the signal as you look at the long tail of the supply chain. Over the last decade, we have allowed products to proliferate, but we've not changed our systems to deal with products that are not forecastable and require a different manufacturing strategy. And I know of no manufacturer that has effectively managed complexity. These are resilience issues. And I think that as we think about resilience, we've got to really look at it through a peer group. So let's take an example. This is Schneider Electric. Annette Clayton was one of my very favorite clients at Schneider Electric, right? If you know Annette, she was brilliant. One of the best strategies that I've ever seen on supply chain actually came from Annette. But if you look at Schneider Electric in an orbit chart, where we look at inventory turns versus operating margin, and to improve resilience, we can't look at cost. We've got to look at margin. We can't just look at back office. We've got to look at from the channel. You can see that it's not linear, but Annette made incredible progress. But did Schneider Electric outperform their peer group? No. When you look at the area, remember your calculus, and the Schneider Electric pattern versus the industry, you can see they did not outperform their peer group. And at Schneider Electric, we've gone from 200 planners to 1,400 planners. We are increasing the nervousness in a complex system. So when I talk about efficiency, I don't want you to just think about a single flow for cost. I want you to think about resilience against the peer group. I want you to think that most companies manage functional silos. If you're sitting here and you're thinking that manufacturing excellence is OEE and lowest manufacturing cost, you are decreasing resilience. You are throwing the supply chain out of balance because you must look at things like schedule adherence and first pass yield and margin. The lowest manufacturing cost will throw the supply chain out of balance and cause it to be less resilient. And most people are really focused on these conflicting metrics, and the alignment issues in the organization have grown threefold in the last decade as we've become more global. Do you feel that? Yeah. You know, when I did this analysis 15 years ago, procurement was much closer to manufacturing, better able to work together. As we grew the global supply chain, which in this chart we look at what is important about alignment and how are we actually doing, we used to just have problems with the commercial teams, with sales. But now procurement and manufacturing have large gaps. Customer service and transportation have large gaps. Few companies have really adequately defined supply chain excellence. And it's important as we think about manufacturing to think about how does what we do on the manufacturing floor improve the balance sheet? How does it improve growth? How does it improve margin? How does it improve inventory? And how does it improve assets? And that's where I think we start to have a good conversation about resilience. What do you think? What resonates about that for you? Questions, thoughts? Does it provoke anything in your head? And we don't consider, right? How do we consider those trade-offs? It would be nice to have a process. And lots of times people think, well, it's S&OP, but S&OP is less effective today than it used to be. And only 9% of companies design their supply chains. So I was a chemical engineer. I couldn't get out of school unless I could design distillation columns. But 9% of companies actively design their supply chains. What a travesty. And when I do have somebody that's designing the supply chain, they're typically in the logistics function, and the people in the financial area don't know they exist. And they don't know the network design tools. And the best way to drive the concept of supply chain as a nonlinear system is to get those network design tools into the boardroom and show people that functional metrics throw the supply chain out of balance. The other thing is we need to measure right? We can't just talk about net zero. We got to measure it. We got to automate the networks. We can't just talk about improving forecast. We need to measure forecast value add. We can't just talk about the bullwhip effect. We need to measure it. How many people put their efforts towards measuring these kind of things for continuous improvement? Because this is the essence of reliability for the supply chain, just like quality of conformance is the essence of reliability for manufacturing. Thoughts, questions? How many of you design your supply chain? Okay, you can put your hand up high, be a proud voice. How long have you designed your supply chain? And do you have a clear definition of resilience? When I talk about this definition, does this resonate with you? Okay, and what would the hiccups be? Staffing, planning, people on the manufacturing floor, executive teams? I would argue that the understanding of the executive team level is probably our biggest issue. That the understanding of the supply chain as a complex nonlinear system and the role of manufacturing is one of our biggest barriers. Anybody else got a thought? Okay, well, let me continue here. Maybe I can provoke more thoughts. So the global supply chain assumed three things that are no longer true. They assumed that logistics would always be available. There is nothing in common between distribution requirements planning and transportation. Logistics became a constraint in the pandemic, and we did not manage it well. We assumed that we'd have rational government policy. We're going to leave that one alone. We're in Washington, right? And we assumed we would have low variability. The level of demand and supply variability has increased, but we're not measuring it, right? I encourage you to measure the coefficient of variation of demand and forecastability. Our ability to manage variability has not improved. We had the global supply chain pressure index. We all went through the pandemic. We're still standing, thank heavens. But this index is very logistics centric and doesn't really show you the impact of demand variability and the impact of planning that does not really deal with the issues. We talk about supply chain excellence, but are you aware that we're holding 28 more days of inventory in a warehouse? Look at the growth of inventory over the years and think about inventory as both your most important buffer, because most people have totally utilized capacity, most important buffer, and your biggest source of waste. And most people have corporate sustainability metrics, but they don't think about inventory as waste. They don't think about all the inventory that we move, all the inventory in our distribution centers that we've got to keep the lights on. And why do we have such a growth of inventory? It's because primarily we focused on safety stock. We did not manage cycle stock or in transit stock well, because most decisions were made on Excel spreadsheets. And so when I talk about inventory, I'm talking about managing the form and function of inventory. As demand variability increases, I need to push inventory back in the supply chain and change my strategies, and I need to manage all the functions of inventory. And I can't do that very well if I don't design the supply chain. And one of the things I'd like you to do when you go home is put a piece of paper in front of your employees and ask them to draw the supply chain. And then they're going to look at you like you've got four heads, right? Because they're going to be like, Laura, why are you making me draw a supply chain? Well, when I teach the class on supply chain excellence, I've only had one person put a customer on their drawing in supply chain. Most people will start with a truck, a smokestack, a bin, a factory, a mill. But isn't the supply chain really about the customer? And how do we align the customer from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier, right? How do we help people to understand that the role of the supply chain is the delivery to the customer? I've actually had groups where I've worked and facilitated, and I invited the people from customer service to talk about Supply Chain 2030, and they're like, why are you inviting customer service to a supply chain meeting, right? It's the essence of the fact that we're very functional. And our processes as we get towards 2030 need to move to be outside in. They need to look at forecast value add. They need to look at the bullwhip effect, and we need to use outside-in data. And most of the systems that we have today, the advanced planning and the enterprise resource planning systems, are legacy because they're schema on read. I mean, schema on write, not schema on read. So what we do is we take all our data and we put our data in a data jail called relational database, and then we argue about why it's not clean. 80% of the data in the supply chain is never used. So as we go to the graph and we go to narrow AI, you're going to see that most of the investments that you have in supply chain are going to shift to be much more outside in, so that we can sense streaming data like AIS data on containers, or we can sense what's happening in the channel with minimal latency. And that's what I'm writing about and doing some work with technologists. And one of the issues is we talk about visibility, but if I go through my research where I measure visibility over the years, we have not improved our ability to see and act in the supply chain. I work with one company who said, Laura, I've got 1,700 employees who have data in the title, but we have no insights. Do you feel that? Because we're drowning in data and low on insights. And part of it is because we got all our data locked in these data jails.
So as a former, I ran the COVID supply chain for FEMA, HHS, and DoD.
Okay, good.
The visibility side, these guys, you'll see, we have definitely moved mountains as far as visualization, understanding where our problem sets are. I think the biggest challenge that we have is, to your point, the C-suite, right? The supply chain was a cool buzzword during the pandemic, but now it's like, oh, it's annoying. And when you think about global, people that have listened to me speak before, our greatest adversary has none of the problems you put on the very first slide. They own their own logistics. There's not a problem with China's logistics. They own the ports. There's no problem with workforce. There's no problem with regulations. And they own most of the critical minerals. So for us, I would say that we went through a time frame of manufacturing where we got really good at just in time, right? That was, if the shorter and I use the Walmart theory, right? The shorter that I actually had Walmart paying for it, right? For better for Walmart, worse for me as the vendor. And I supplied Walmart for years. Assholes. Sorry, you're on the phone. But I think that right now where people are struggling, right, and workforce demands are huge, right, especially for those of us that work in the defense industrial base where we're having to deal with the federal minimum wage. California is now feeling the repercussions of that they can't have people even working in fast food shops because they have to be $20 an hour. So we have a workforce complicated problem. I think that our international shipping capability is good, with the exception that we run our greatest weakness is the unions at the port because they decide to go out, or the unions in our supply chain. So I'm the visualization I see we've changed a great deal on. I think that building more inventory is something people take into consideration, but that costs money, and that's something they're not very interested in doing that. And then I'm a big cyber person, and I think cyber has more of a place in the supply chain right now than anything.
Okay, so I'm struggling with how to respond because you gave me about 15 different questions. Let me just give you some thoughts. Mm-hmm. We have self-service HR. We do not have self-service supply chains. We have a labor issue. Today, 15 of my friends retired in planning on LinkedIn. The lowest job satisfaction of anybody in supply chain is a planner. But yet we're growing planners. We're not looking at self-service. Why are we not thinking about generative AI for content? Why do we have reports? Why are we not getting rid of planners and making planning self-service for business leaders? Why are we not measuring the bullwhip effect? Now, you talked about how you made everything perfect, but I would allege that if you go home and you measure the bullwhip effect and the efficiency of the bullwhip effect, and you run it through a network design model, you're going to see that there are plenty of opportunities. So I just want us to learn from the past to unlearn. And I think the pandemic gives us a lot of examples. And as you think about the supply chain and you think about all the data we don't use, the unstructured text. I was working with one company who's like, I need to do a survey to understand how customers like me. And I'm like, why don't you mine the unstructured text and email and have a listening post that you can listen to what customers think? I had one company who's like, I need to use customer forecasts to forecast demand. The customer forecast will never help you with demand. But I'm like, you're the third largest rail carrier in the United States. Why are you not using the RFID readers to your manufacturing customers to look at flow? We're not looking at all the data we have. And we're not thinking hard enough about how do we use it. So my challenge is I want you to think about how you build purple unicorns. And you might think, well, what's a purple unicorn? A purple unicorn is a person that is really questioning today's supply chain practices and is willing to get immersed in the evolution of technology and can drive improvement because they're really good at influence management. And I give you some examples. For example, NoSQL for unified data models and a real-time perpetual inventory signal. Let's take retail. I have a very large retailer that has 42 instances in Manhattan, and you might think, well, that might be easy to roll up for a good perpetual inventory signal to look at cross-channel. It takes them 8 hours. A non-SQL data model for perpetual inventory can give me inventory across plants, across distribution centers for very low cost, but I have to invest in a different technology. Let's look at machine learning, semantic reconciliation, rules-based autonomy, and ontologies, right? How do we automate for cognitive learning? How many of you are actually working on, how do we do this? Let's think about how do we use unstructured text mining for either supplier reliability or listening post and building listening post. Let's think about all the data that streams at us, all the data on the manufacturing floor, all of the signals on a container, all of the GPS signals. A lot of people will implement control towers, but what good is a control tower if I don't control anything? What good is a control tower if I don't bring that back for insights, which gets me to the ability for you to build learning engines across your organization to a balanced scorecard. Supply chain excellence is not functional excellence. It is the ability to drive outcomes. And my challenge to you is to think about these new technologies harder and not just think about how I make my current processes go faster, because today's processes are not best practice. We must learn from the past, unlearn, because what we do causes resilience issues. And to do this, I need to help organizations learn about new technologies, and I have to have a learning environment where they're not encumbered by a fixed ROI or a project plan, and I have to embrace failure, because failure is where I get some of the best learning. So I want to leave you today with a couple of thoughts about resilience, about where to focus, right? So when you go back and people say, well, what did that crazy Lora talk about, right? I want you to consider building outside-in processes. I know of no company that uses channel data well. Not Procter & Gamble, not Reckitt Benckiser, not Clorox, no company. And I've followed this for 25 years. Distribution data, market insight data. The average time from something happening in the channel to a company taking action is 6 weeks. 6 weeks is too long. We need to be able to sense in the channel, translate it, and align the organization. Outside-in processes. Implement supplier development. Supplier development is how do I drive to make the gap small between quality of design and quality of conformance. I have an automotive manufacturer that has a 1-800 call for all suppliers to dial in when they've got a question about that. Intel senses risk around the world and sends teams to help their suppliers. But most organizations pay suppliers based upon net 90, change their purchase orders 5 to 6 times, and don't hold themselves accountable for their signals. Supply chain is a collaborative team sport without people that collaborate. So are you a good team player? And as you think about designing your supply chain, think about the operating strategy and how you pull that design to get through the functional excellence question to drive supply chain learning at the executive team. And as you think about what that is, focus holistically on inventory, form and function of inventory, not just safety stock. Manage flows, because if you manage the entire supply chain as an efficient supply chain, you will make yourself less resilient. This cannot be about the lowest cost. This has to be about the best potential of a flow for cost, quality, customer service, and inventory. And then rationalize your complexity. One of my favorite stories on complexity was Campbell's. They had 33 different cuts of carrots. You know, when I eat minestrone soup versus, vegetable soup, I don't sit and think about the cut of the carrot. They went from 33 to 3, and the results were outstanding. If we think about the semiconductor industry, if we rationalize the platforms, we could really help the fabs. Develop your balanced scorecard. And then develop teams of purple unicorns to test and learn. Because the essence of resilience is you. It is our ability to drive supply chain leadership, to be good trading partners, and own the supply chain holistically. So my name is Lora Cecere. I do research. I'm not a consultant. I try to drive new thinking in supply chain to help people to unlearn what they think are best practices.